Hi students, welcome to Houston, where it's been wedding grand central for me. And for you, we're headed into week 5 for podcasting and broadcasting. And I'm getting really excited to see how your podcast ideas are going to start shaping up. And before I forget, someone asked me earlier this evening, what are these production elements that your learning assignment has talked about, or your learning activity has requested you to incorporate into your plan of action. And these are production elements are simply the sound effects or the plan for special audio, background, different elements that you might incorporate into your podcast or broadcast, or as it is. So be thinking about what kind of sound effects or what kind of audio feed that you might have in your podcast. So that said, I have some things that I'd like to review with you from the past few weeks that deal with content. And speaking of content, last week and I was talking to you about presentation, and I used as an example the Oreo cookie. Well, imagine, much to my surprise, when I was doing some shopping, either Friday or Saturday night, at the grocery store, and I happened to glance over as I was looking for butter. I can't believe they have butter and cookies on the same aisle, opposite sides of an aisle. As I was headed towards the butter, I happened to glance over and I saw Oreo cookies, Oreos. And as I went on to the butter, it occurred to me there's something different about these Oreo cookies. Now you have to know, I'm not actually in the habit of eating Oreos right now, or eating any sort of cookies. As I've said previously, my daughter's wedding is April 25th, so we can well imagine that I'm not given to eat cookies right now. I'm trying to cut back a bit. But I saw something a little bit different. It seemed to do with the packaging. And as I continued on to the butter, I reflected visually on what I'd seen, and I thought, are those not in cellophane packaging anymore? So I actually got to the end of the aisle, put the butter in the cart, made a U-turn, flipped a U-turn, went all the way back down to the other end and laid my hands on some of those Oreo cookies, and lo and behold, there's a different package. They're in a different style packaging. No more cellophane wrappers, and I checked all the shelves, all the various packages, and all different kinds of flavors and colors and coverings for those Oreos, but couldn't see not a one. I mean, they looked pretty good. They had really good digital presentations of the Oreos that were inside, but no more digital or no more cellophane packaging. So there goes my illustration. So I guess I'll have to come up with a new illustration. So the point is, times change. Times they are a-changing. That's the thing about these podcasts. When we used to talk about podcasts, we were basically talking about audios. I mean, the best we could do basically was to get a digital audio file. It's pretty easy to do. And we could embed a digital audio file pretty much anywhere on the internet, in any sort of another website. We could embed it into a radio program. And we could get that podcast pretty much anywhere. We could download a podcast, much like we download a PDF file. And you just get a podcast. We could get a feed to a podcast and have access to it. We could pay for podcasts. And much as we just pay for iTunes radio, not radio, but iTunes, download albums even. So we could download somebody's podcast, whether it was a broadcast of a radio show, syndicated radio program or something like that, or music. And we could easily do that. And they could charge us for it. And it was kind of a cool thing. Now, really in the place of I mean, we still do that, of course, but we also refer to podcasting interchangeably kind of with broadcasting when it comes to these short minute to two, no more than maybe 2.5 minute quick news shows even, or really news shows or opinion pieces. So when we say your podcast that you need to prepare for class, that's really what we're talking about. It's going to be on YouTube, so obviously you're going to have a video component to it, such as what I'm doing right now. This could be considered a podcast, except that this is more of a rambling lecture that's hitting various points that I've made some notes on. It's not well scripted. It's not well produced in that sense, not organized in that sense. It's not going to have sound effects. I don't even have my trusty headphones on, which I actually keep pretty close. I do have my equipment nearby, but I'm not actually going to use this for this sort of a, not really even a lecture, but just a kind of notes that I catch up with you on each week, or every other week, as it were. So your podcast is going to be different, your broadcast is going to be different, and it's going to be highly structured, something that's very much planned out, very much produced on your part. So that said, we're already talking about that. So, we could go ahead and continue to talk about that for a moment. Let's look at some of the requirements for that. I'm looking right at your agenda here that talks about your podcast, and it says critical assignment, podcast, project, outline. I just want to go over it with you because you basically have 3 weeks to produce this, and in each week you'll be given more or less time, but a lot more time and fewer assignments so that you can work on this. You'll continue to have reading assignments so that you can make sure that you cover your text well and cover things that will come up in this. But this week specifically, you're going to include in your outline, you're going to submit an outline, and you're going to create the current event, not create the event, you're going to talk about what current event that you will cover. You're going to state the event, the rationale to why it is current, and the support for it. In other words, a print or broadcast of it being reported in the media. So you're going to put into your outline and give some points about what the current event, give a little summary of it, and then put a little, a couple of points about why it's relevant, why it's important, why it's current, and then include the actual print, link to the print, or a link to the broadcast of it in your outline. Then you're going to discuss your production schedule. Describe how you're going to present the news according to your textual references. Basically that's what you're going to do, just present your production schedule. And then include a timeline that states down to each second what you're going to present. So you're going to have your work cut out for you in this. I mean, presenting your production schedule down to each second. So you've got 2.5 minutes maximum. So, first 15 seconds might be your introduction, and you're going to say in that outline, introduce the subject and how you're going to do that. Now, you don't have to actually at this point write the script out. It can be your script, but your script does not due this week. And it certainly doesn't need to be refined. You can be more general, though. You could say, introduction of whatever your topic is, describing background, naming the mountains, whatever it is that you're going to be introducing, or getting right to the point if there's an accident, or a situation at Disney with the measles, or whatever your current event happens to be. You might have the Supreme Court case in Washington, D.C. that you're going to cover. It's any current event, why it's rational and why it's current. The cheerleaders going to Florida for a cheer off or a cheer competition in Daytona. Any current event and why it's current and why it's newsworthy. But there does have to be a print or broadcast being reported in the media. And when I say in the media, I don't mean necessarily Slate or National Enquirer or some alternative media organization. I mean mainstream media, Fox or CNN, because those are cable networks. So mainstream media, cable network, your local news affiliate would suffice. Okay, so that's basically what we need for that. And as you're working on that podcast, you're going to have a lot of good pointers this week from your text, specifically that one that you should have, you're kind of wearing out by now, that green text. You're looking at both of your texts, of course, but the one with the spiral spine is the one that you're really looking into at this point, the news now, because it's not the theory, it's the practicum. It's giving you the advice for how to write. It's giving you reminders on interviewing, organizing, and so forth. And what's really, really cool this time is in chapters 9 and 10, it's going to be giving you really good advice on things that you may not think immediately of, like hair and makeup. I mentioned to you, I know you probably thought I was a little nuts a couple weeks ago when I came to you in a broadcast, and I said, I actually go into the restroom, comb my hair, put a little lipstick on, my handy little stuff that I keep right at my desk, and I'm noticing I should have powdered my nose because I got a little sun this weekend at my grandson's ball game. But things like that are really important when you're doing a broadcast. You're going to be paying extra attention to your wardrobe because you're basically, either live in the field or live in the studio. When I looked at this in your text, live from the field, I immediately thought of covering hurricanes, being out there in the field with a big yellow raincoat, flapping around with my cameras. There's lots of different instances that when you're the reporter, you will adapt to various circumstances. But when you are producing the broadcast and you're behind the camera and you have controlled circumstances or a controlled situation, then you have more time, you have more focus, you should take more time to make sure that all of those aspects that we're talking about, your environment, and then what you look like, and what your subjects look like, that are under your control, are more controlled. Because when you're outside of your newsroom, when you're outside in an environment that you can't control, then it's a lot different. And even then, you'd be surprised at the massive things that happen behind the scenes that we don't always see. Although you wouldn't be as surprised coming from Southern California, being from that Hollywood area, where sometimes you're even privy to some of those Hollywood sets and those movie scenes and so forth, you wouldn't probably be as surprised as some others who don't have access to that sort of thing. Okay, so today's been a long day. Just wanted to share that with you. Today is the 10th anniversary of the death of Terri Schiavo. For some of you, you may be too young to remember Terri Schiavo or the Schindler family or what she represents. Others of you may handily remember, and some may just remember from textbooks even or from news reports. But I actually covered the Terri Schiavo situation live. That was during a little bit more than a decade that I was a newspaper for a special interest publication in Florida for 12 years. And about several years into my employ there, I became involved in covering the Terri Schiavo case. We were a statewide publication. And so on March 31st, March 30th, March 31st, 2005, on day 13, that nutrition and hydration was withheld by the order of a judge, Judge George Greer. I'll never forget. I actually interviewed him at one point. Terri Schiavo died. I was actually just a few miles from the hospice where I had been for 13 days. I had been basically camped out with the rest of the media. A vast tent city, basically, camped out across from the hospital. I was actually staying with my cousin who lived just a few miles away in her daughter's little bedroom. I had alternately gone from a hotel to my cousin's house, and when I got the call around, I think 3 o'clock in the morning, maybe 5 o'clock in the morning, I'm not sure. I'd stayed up very, very late writing a story and sending it with pictures. And I was woken by some friends, ironically, news friends from London, who were there covering the news. And we had kind of each night decided who would stay and pull what we call the night shift, and to be on hand in case she passed during the night. And so I had decided to get some sleep that night. I was just exhausted. And so they called me and told me, and I raced back over there, and just in time for an early morning press conference. And that was one of the longest days, really, of my life. And so this morning I was actually kind of unprepared. It's been a long news week. We've had spring break issues, Panama City Beach, students getting shot, just a lot of coverage. And Panama City Beach was another place that I have history with. I covered a big story there in 1996 and had done some subsequent coverage. But anyway, so this morning I'm kind of just getting ready to plug away at the news, and I get a couple of tweets. And I thought, who's tweeting at me already this morning? I haven't even tweeted out anything. And it was a friend from Florida, actually, the person who's now serving in the position that I used to be in, sort of. An assistant editor. I was the managing editor there. And what they tweeted at me was the 10th anniversary story of the Terri Schiavo case. 10 years later, still a tragedy. And what was significant about the story was the news organization that I partnered with on a national level ran a story, and then about a third of the way through dropped in a couple of paragraphs that I wrote a year after Terry's death. And in those paragraphs, they basically described my coverage, or I described my coverage, because those paragraphs were from a first person that I wrote. Typically, when I cover the news, I rarely write a first person that expresses my own feelings or my own opinion about a story. I try to keep myself objective, fair, and somewhat removed, at least in my reader's eyes, from the story, so that there maintains that distance. I had always prided myself on doing that and not writing editorials or publicly commenting on the stories that I wrote. About a year after Terry died, and about a year after I had done well over 50 stories, maybe 100 stories on the Terry Schiavo case, and taken just hundreds of pictures, and many of which were published later in a book by the attorney, David Gibbs, that wrote a book about the case, and by Johnny Erickson Tata, who did a documentary about the case. But a year later, I decided to go ahead and write a few paragraphs about my coverage and how that changed the way, potentially, that I would cover some things as a reporter. And this was interesting for me in two ways that the news service included my remarks. Number one, interesting in that news service in particular has shifted gears a little bit organizationally in how they cover news, and the news organization was somewhat different in who they quoted initially in the story, and the story was less clearly focused on the issue that that made it the national, or the story that had gotten worldwide attention 10 years ago. 10 years ago, it was a story that got attention for it being a pro-life issue or right to life issue, or sanctity of human life issue, in that Terry's life was valuable. And it poised itself against euthanasia or right to death proponents. In today's story, 10 years later, the story in the beginning was more about marriage and the sanctity of marriage. And it brought into question marriage laws, and even brought up the notion that perhaps if we'd had stronger no-fault divorce and common law marriage, that this would have never happened, and that Terry's husband would have never had a say in what happened. And so it was just very interesting to me that has been a change in how that news was posed. And so, but back to the actual, and I've kind of gotten off track a little bit, but back to the actual comments that I made back then, because I think they might be helpful for you as you look at news, to see how a reporter's own view can hugely shape a story. And if there's one thing that I learned in all of my reporting in Florida, almost 13 years, or almost 12 years actually, of reporting in Florida, is during the Terry Schiavo case, I learned definitively that oftentimes AP style, which is Associated Press, means that one or two reporters has the chance to shape the news for the entire nation and the entire world. In other words, their worldview, their opinions, in as much as they choose who to quote, what to lead with, what to emphasize in a story, what elements they use per se, that will shape the entire story for the world. Mm-hmm. So whether they decide to play up sympathy for one figure or for another, or look at something through the lens of a victim or a policeman per se, or the resident of a town, or a person of one ethnicity or another, that is going to make a huge difference in how that news plays out. So it is incredibly important for reporters to be totally honest and transparent in approaching that news and being able to say, am I doing this in all fairness to the people that are watching and to the readers and to the news organization that I work for and that I serve? In the case, and I'll put this disclaimer on there so that this will help you understand. In the case of the Terry Schiavo case, I worked for Florida Baptist Witness. Florida Baptist Witness was produced by and for Southern Baptists in Florida. So when I went out to report the news, I had on my mind that not only were Florida Baptists, but others going to read my stories, because at that time they were available online for anybody who wanted to read them, but they were primarily meant for the readership of Baptists. And they were expected to have a Baptist worldview, a Christian worldview. So I was unashamed of pursuing a Christian worldview with my stories. That's what Florida Baptists expected, was a Christian worldview. So, is that dishonest? I don't think so. Not any more so than, say, the Jerusalem Post, producing things knowing that that newspaper would be read by people in Jerusalem, or is read. Now, and that gets into a whole nother discussion, except I wanted to give you a disclaimer when I read the following to you. Let me read that excerpt from the story that was produced by Baptist Press, which is the official news service of Florida Baptist Witness. The story starts out, and then after some background, it says, Joni Hannigan, then managing editor of the Florida Baptist Witness, covered Schiavo's struggle for life extensively. Hannigan wrote in a 2006 Baptist Press column that the moral issues surrounding Schiavo's death were clear. By the time I had read volumes of court transcripts, sat in court and listened to Michael Schiavo's attorney, heard Schiavo speak at press conferences, and read excerpts of the attorney's book representing his worldview, the coverage strategy I employed seemed elementary to me, Hannigan wrote. My convictions led me to a conscientious approach to reporting that made me wary of seeking to promote views which openly condoned euthanasia and adultery. Simply put, I would not actively seek to give ink to Michael Schiavo's distorted views of love and fidelity, and would not knowingly engage in unfruitful interviews with Schiavo's attorney, whose pro-euthanasia views had been clearly established, Hannigan wrote. What does all that mean? Well, really what it means is that after all of that, after listening to the court cases, reading the books and so forth, I quickly realized that George Philos, the attorney, for Michael Schiavo, the husband of Terry Schiavo, was a huge pro-euthanasia expert, sat on panels, wrote a book advocating euthanasia. He wasn't just any old lawyer, not the garden variety lawyer that goes to Duke Law School, gets a law degree, and then decides to represent a client. He had a huge stake invested in the output of this case. He was on the board of the hospital, the hospice, where Terry Schiavo was sent to die by her husband. He had a lot riding on this case, and not just whatever legal fees he got. He continues to sell books and write and lecture on euthanasia, not on the law, but he uses the case of Terry Schiavo to benefit. So I was right in being wary of what he was doing to lecture and promote his client's case as love and fidelity, knowing that Michael Schiavo had already cohabitated, had been living with another woman for years before his wife died. And at one point, George Philos actually, when I did give him an interview, when I interviewed him, told me that anybody with any sense at all who had a wife who had Alzheimer's, of course they would seek to go out and have a little bit of action on the side. And that's about as crudely as he told me. So there you have it. If your spouse has a debilitating disease, George Philos, the attorney for Michael Schiavo, said it would be perfectly okay to go have a little hanky-panky. And maybe shack up with another person and have children even. Or better yet, euthanize them. Because they couldn't possibly be the spouse that you need. So I knew his ethic, or lack thereof, was not one that was consistent. And one that our readers needed to hear over and again, since they would be hearing it all over the mainstream media anyway. So what I meant by giving ink to his distorted views, his and his attorneys, Michael Schiavo's and his attorneys, was the whole idea of fairness being played out with, okay, if this person speaks for 10 minutes, that person has to speak for 10 minutes. If this person has 300 words, that person has to have 300 words. If you have 4 paragraphs from this person, you have to have 4 paragraphs from that person. No, not necessarily so. Often I will say the opponents believe in this, and kind of summarize what the opponents are saying, while the proponents of the bill, I might go on for a page, depending on worldview and who I'm reporting for. So it does depend on who I'm reporting for. Does that make me less of a reporter? No, actually, it means that I know my audience. And more so in today's news world, that is where news agencies are headed. I might have fought this some years ago. I might have said that's not right, but especially after the Terry Schiavo case, I learned a huge lesson. A huge lesson. There is such thing as objectivity, and that is to be true to who we really are, and to be truthful about it, and to not hide behind a screen of thinking that our worldview doesn't matter, because our worldview does, and it shapes from who we interview to how we dramatize a situation to show that situation in a way that's favorable to the ideas that we want promoted. And we know that. And so to be true to our readers and to be true to ourselves, we just need to put that up front. And then we're honest, and then we're fair. Okay, I've kept you for 35 whole minutes, and I hope it's been worth it, and I hope it's been valuable. Please email me, call me if you have any questions. And I appreciate it, and have a very blessed Easter.